Part of the problem with the attention and the distractibility and the focus and impulsiveness is what the brain has learned. I talked about sequential processing normally develops until about 7 to 9 years of age, and then without intervention it stops. Part of what happens there, well, let me demonstrate it. I'm going to start giving you a sequence of numbers, all right? Just like I did in that previous test. And this time, when your brain stops processing the numbers, raise your hand, okay? Which means at the point at which it all starts falling apart, raise your hand, okay? Fair enough? All right, are you ready? I'm going to give you that J again. That's a good one. 8, 7, 0, 3, 9, 2, 6, 1, 4, 2, 8, 0. Okay, we got a lot of hands. All right. Now, generally what happens there is, let's say your digit span was a 7. Somewhere around 8 or 9, you started to crash and burn, okay? And your brain learned, okay, your brain has learned essentially where you can process. And when you go a step or two beyond that, your brain learns, bye, I'm going somewhere else, okay? And whether or not you listen to a bunch of digits or you're listening to a lecture or whatever, your brain stops processing at a point. Okay? So our kids who have these processing problems, their brain learns when to quit. Right? And unfortunately in the classroom, that's the majority of time. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Our son in junior high said, Mom, it sounds like a teacher's talking in a different language.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because the point, you just felt how it feels when it falls apart. That's what happens. And the kids hate that. I mean, they really hate that. And they often learn, I'm just not going to participate in this.
Can it be localized to a specific topic or subject?
Sure.
I just wonder, because I know in my own personal experience, I did very well in school. I don't mean to brag, but I did very well in school. But I remember in 7th grade when math for me just stopped. And I struggled so hard to just pass, and even through college and even through graduate school, anytime math came up, when it was not simple math that I learned in elementary school, or, I can do budgeting, that simple kind of math, but anything algebra, geometry on, it just stopped. And I had to struggle hard just to get the grades to pass the classes. And even still, I'm married to a math teacher, and he'll bring up something, honey, what's a parabola?
Yeah. Let me talk about math for a minute. Because almost universally, schools do a horrendous job of teaching math.
That's what my husband says too. He's not from this country, and the teaching curriculum that he's had here, that he's been given here as a teacher here, he thinks is horrible.
A big part of the problem with math is a visual process. Okay? Meaning it's a matter of steps, and if you can visualize the steps, you can do the process. Okay? And how does virtually every teacher teach math? They're up on a blackboard, they're writing a problem, and they're talking non-stop, okay? And the kids are trying to understand what they're saying, but because they don't have digit spans of 20, okay, they can't process those 2,000 words the teacher just used to describe long division. And because they're working so hard to process what the teacher's saying, they can't see it. If the kids knew what was going on in the brain, they'd say, would you please shut up so I can see it? Okay. And you'd be amazed, a parent, you want to teach your child a math process? Rapidly work problems in front of them and don't say a thing. It's not hard, okay? But again, not only do we not typically find out how the kids learn and find out their inefficiencies, we even haven't gone to the step to look at what we're teaching and teach it in a way that makes sense. By the way, I have an old friend who is here, and her husband was president of BYU in Hawaii. And a number of years ago, they brought me out to lecture there. And we had a lunch break, and I had a young student who was ushering me around. And as we were sitting down to lunch, and was sitting down with Alton, her husband, who was the president of the college, and the vice president of the college, this kid asked me a question I'd rather she not ask. She said, "Bob, how would you teach a college class?" And I told her, the reality is, the real purpose of teaching a class is to teach something. And if you've in fact taught something, the student will leave the class with that something and retain it for at least months, preferably years. And if that doesn't happen, you haven't done anything. And I said, therefore, if I'm teaching a college class, on the first day, I would give the class a printed list of the few pieces of information I would want them to retain and take away from the course. And I would tell them, on the last day of class, I'll test you on that short list. And then I'd spend the entire semester turning them on to the subject. Okay? Well, Alton, the president of the class, turned to his vice president, and I don't remember what his name was, but George, he said, "What do you think of that?" And George said, "I think that's nonsense." Matter of fact, George said, "I expect my students to learn everything I teach in my classes." Everything. He said, everything from the text, the notes, my lectures. And Alton said to him, "Well, when you test them, do you test them on the important stuff?" And he said, "Absolutely not. Because my good students know they're responsible for the most trivial piece of information." And then he asked, I asked the vice president what it was he taught, and it was something ridiculous, like ancient Japanese history. What did he really think the students were going to take away from that class, and know a few years, It's such nonsense, okay? All right. Yeah, there's such a long list of what we do wrong educationally, it's hard to know where to start. Yes, ma'am?
Can you help me understand what causes impulsiveness?
Yeah. You're impulsive primarily because of processing, all right? If you can only think in so many pieces, when you run out of pieces, you stop thinking. All right, so if that processing is really low, you're impulsive because you can't think things through to a conclusion. Okay.
So when he runs into the classroom and shoves another child, he's processing that he needs to be the first one back to his desk.
And end of discussion. Absolutely right.
So to be disciplined for that action means nothing to him.
Correct.
So how do you help him to overcome
You
that?
build his process.
Okay. And that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because one of the saddest parts of all of this to a parent is that when a child has a struggle with learning, begins to fall behind, loses his confidence, becomes impulsive, socially struggles, and his whole person becomes deflated and he kind of loses himself.
Yeah, and is it, how much of a surprise is it, these kids become suicidal?
And to start rebuilding, there's hope, even in the teens.
Oh, yeah. Personally, when I was a kid in school, they wouldn't have had enough labels for me. And a number of years ago, I had quadruple bypasses. And they slipped me in at the end of the day, which I discovered was not a good thing to do. And I came out of anesthesia at about 9 o'clock in the evening, which is not a good thing because the doctors don't show up until about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. So I had a big tube down my throat, and I was wide awake, and I'm gesturing to nurses to come save me, kind of thing, right? And I had this male nurse, who was one of the ugliest people I've ever seen, come over me and said, if you touch that, we'll strap you down. Okay. So fortunately, I had studied hypnosis and used self-hypnosis to survive the night. But the other thing that helped me through the night was somewhere probably around 1 or 2 a.m. it occurred to me that this wasn't quite as bad as school. Okay? That's how much I enjoyed the process. So yeah, you know, the kids who have these learning issues, you know, it's horrendous because it's attacking everything they are.